All right. Howdy, folks. I'm Micah Weinberg, CEO of California Forward, here with my friend Eileen Fitzgerald from Wells Fargo, who I'll introduce in just a little bit. Welcome to the next installment in our Building Equitable Economies webinar, focusing on a really important project that we've been working on that we've called Regions Build Together, Housing Agenda for All of California. Next slide, please. So just a little bit of housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded. Please do keep your microphones muted when you're not speaking for the speakers. And the webinar will conclude with a pretty extensive Q&A. And so to ask questions, go over to that panel, which is on the right-hand side of your screen, and put some questions into the question and answer panel. Fine to do that throughout the presentation, and we'll loop back to them at the end after we go through the different presentations. Next slide. Okay. Hi, I'm Micah, and we've got Eileen here with us as well, who's the head of Housing Affordability Philanthropy at Wells Fargo. Talk a little bit more about Wells Fargo in just a second. Next slide. We had a number of really important partners in this work, and I wanted to start by acknowledging the Wells Fargo and the Wells Fargo Foundation. This work to document and lift up regional best practices that you'll be hearing about today was funded by the Wells Fargo Foundation. But as important as the funding of this work has been, even more important has been Wells Fargo's partnership in this effort and support for many of the innovations that you're going to be hearing about today. As a massive financial institution and a generous philanthropy, Wells Fargo can be a powerful part of the solution to make housing affordable and secure for all people in all the diverse regions of our state. And in just a minute, I'm going to introduce Eileen Fitzgerald, who will talk to you a little bit more about what Wells Fargo is doing in this area. But I also want to acknowledge our research partners in this project who are a part of our California Stewardship Network. And those are the Bay Area Council Economic Institute, the Los Angeles County Economic Development Corporation, and the Inland Empire Economic Partnership. And I'll talk a little bit more about their role in just a second. Next slide. Okay, so let's start out today with a little bit of hope. You know, although progress towards ensuring housing affordability might have stalled out a little bit at the state level here in California, there's some really exciting things happening at the local and regional levels. And in particular, I want to give a huge shout out to the cities of Sacramento and Berkeley, that in Berkeley's case, just this week, have taken the bold and important steps to undo racially motivated downzonings from the middle of the last century and re-legalize the production of multifamily housing of up to 4 units in most of their cities. So in fact, rerouting the housing conversation in our regional communities is very much what this webinar is about, and rerouting our entire public policy process in our regional communities is very much what California Forward is all about. So in the project you're going to be hearing about today, we asked the question, how can we leverage our understanding of the many diverse geographies and communities of our massive nation state to address both the technical and political issues associated with housing production? So technically, the Eastern Coachella Valley is extraordinarily different than urban Los Angeles. So you need solutions that are tailored to each of those areas. And you'll be hearing from leaders of 2 amazing organizations, Lift to Rise and Genesis LA, that are taking very different, community-generated, regionally tailored approaches in each of these areas. Politically, as long as building housing is something that is sort of a fight between the state and the local levels, it's gonna be super difficult to get progress. So you'll also be hearing about exciting types of community-led processes, such as Green Means Go in Sacramento, and how we can make sure that the housing progress is happening in partnership between the private sector and the public sector, in partnership between our regional and local communities and the state-wide action, if we're really going to get back on track and start making real progress for the people in the state. So before we jump into the presentations, I want to do 3 quick things. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about California Forward and how this fits into our whole approach to making change for the people of California. I'm then going to give you just a little bit of a view into the findings of the larger report. And then I'm going to introduce my friend Eileen to tell you a little bit more about Wells Fargo and its activities in this area. So at California Forward, our fundamental philosophy is that, look, we've all created over decades the challenges that the state struggles with, and therefore we all need to be a part of the solution. So we appreciate the corporate stewardship of Wells Fargo in this area, and so we partner with them, other businesses, organizations, and institutions that are all interested in being constructively involved in making a difference in the life of people. This is a broader part of our work that brings together a statewide backbone, California Forward, with organizations working in the community, a venue for us all to partner on innovative solutions, and a tool for measuring our progress towards addressing the triple bottom line of racial and economic equity, environmental sustainability, and economic growth. So that's what this chart you've been looking at is all about. It's what we call our circle of life, right? And so this is a project that is very much based on this. So those folks that I talked about, the LAEDC, IEEP, Bay Area Council Economic Institute, they're all a part of our California Stewardship Network that really helps us, through doing these equitable economic projects in the region, understand the real regional priorities. These bubble up to the statewide level where there are interdependencies, similarities, and we move it forward through our California Economic Summit to create really good policy solutions. And then we move towards action and advocacy, sometimes led by us, our California Forward Action Fund, sometimes led by our partners. And we measure it all through the California Dream Index, which is a way of tracking the top 10 indicators of economic mobility and are achieving the triple bottom line in the state. Next plan. Next slide, sorry. So, you know, everything we do is rooted in data. You know, sadly, in California, you know, more than a third of our population is housing, which means that they pay more than 30% of their income on rent or mortgage. And in fact, 17% of folks pay more than 50% of their income on rent or mortgage. Next slide. However, kind of what we think we know about this, you know, when you look at the data in the California Dream Index, is not necessarily consistent with the a real understanding of what's happening in the regional level. So we tend to think, oh, housing is super expensive in the Bay Area. People in the Bay Area are in huge trouble. But you know what? The rest of the state, you know, the rest of the state is fine. Not us on this webinar necessarily, but that's in the public dialogue. That's how people think about this. But actually, the place with the highest housing cost burden is Northern California, north of Sacramento. Yes, housing costs are lower, but incomes are also much lower, meaning that overall, the housing cost burden is higher there. So again, there's a lot more data behind this, but it's really important to understand that there's a tremendous amount of regional differentiation in the state, and it may not be what the kind of conventional wisdom suggests that it is. Next slide. Okay, so I am not going to attempt to summarize a report that is with its regional analyses well over 100 pages long. I'm just going to pull out a few things, and then today mostly we're going to be focusing on a few key innovations. But among the many findings that you all will have so much fun learning all about as you commit to memory the white paper that we've put together, and actually, in much more seriousness, work with us on implementing this plan in the different regions of the state, I want to call out just 4 things. One of the innovations that has been really effective in a lot of different areas of the state is the creation of regional land trusts and regional housing trusts. They look different in different areas, but it's an opportunity essentially to aggregate funding to support below market rate housing development and a number of other critical aspects of getting housing built for people at all income levels of the state. Another project, and we've been really pushing this at the state level, there's a bill by Senator Caballero this year. There are other bills as well, there's a huge transformation going on right now in our economy, moving away largely from brick and mortar retail. So we need to make sure, both for the purposes of community revitalization and housing affordability, to be using that underutilized commercial space, turning it into mixed use, turning it into housing, but it turns out that's super difficult to do, and you need policy support to make it happen. Next slide. All right. Another thing that I want to call out that you can read about more in the report is some great strategies from across the region to engage the public in the development process in a much more transparent, democratic, and effective way. Super quick summary, not through your conventional public meetings, right? You don't want to set up a situation where essentially the deal has already been struck and people are just coming to yell at you about it, right? You need to be leaning in at the outset, working with the community to make sure that you're having the right kind of development. And when you do, you'll find you can often be very supportive of what's being produced. And then finally, it's just true all across the state. We need to vastly reduce the cost of producing housing, whether that housing is permanent supportive housing for homeless folks that sometimes costs over $1 million a unit to produce, or whether it's higher end housing. It doesn't matter. We layer a tremendous amount of fees, costs, delays, regulations on the production of housing, and it's hurting the production of every type of housing unit. Again, much more detail on that in the report. All right, next slide, please. Cool, so I'm gonna pass it over at this point to the Eileen to talk to you a little bit more about Wells Fargo's philanthropic vision. Just quickly, Eileen is the head of housing affordability philanthropy at the Wells Fargo Foundation. She joined the foundation in 2019 after a 25-year career in community development, nonprofit, and housing industry. Most recently, Eileen served as president and chief executive officer of the Stewards of Affordable Housing for the Future, a collaborative of nonprofits that collectively owns and operates more than 140,000 affordable rental homes nationwide, with a focus on advancing creation and preservation of healthy, sustainable, affordable rental homes for low and moderate income households. Thanks for being here this morning, Eileen.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me. So we're really surprised. Sorry, let's start that again. We're really proud at Wells Fargo to support California Forward. We really appreciate the critical role that you, and especially all of you who are joining this webinar, play in creating a collaborative environment and work across California that is key to developing housing affordability solutions. I'd like to thank all my Wells Fargo colleagues, including some you are going to hear from today, but especially Karen Woodruff, who has really shepherded our relationship with California Forward. We're looking forward to learning more about the report's findings. I had looked at the summary slides that Micah just shared, and I think it covers a lot and a lot of critical issues. But why is, and I'll just spend 1 second. We're going to focus in on housing today, but Wells Fargo also supports financial health, which is obviously a key if we're thinking about housing, small business growth, particularly through our Open for Business Fund, and sustainability and social and economic governance. So we're really excited about all of those being so critical in a community's future and how to become more inclusive. But why do we care about housing? Well, fundamentally, it's because we all know that a home is foundational. It's a sanctuary. We know that people have much better health outcomes, educational outcomes, and economic opportunity when they have a stable, healthy, affordable home. Too many communities across the US are grappling with the housing crisis. And I really love that you pulled out the examples of, it's not just the high cost area. It really is, at the end of the day, that gap between what incomes are and what the cost of the housing is. So Wells Fargo is deeply committed to housing affordability solutions where everyone can find that affordable place. We are one of the largest homeownership and multifamily lenders and investors in California. We're also one of the leading employers in California with more than 30,000 employees in the state. So we kind of live every day the challenges, especially when we're in our non-pandemic worlds and we're not all working from home, or many of us have that luxury of working from home. So we see that as an employer. And we really want to advance housing solutions, and particularly to bring a racial equity and sustainability lens. But the pandemic has and resulting economic crisis has made that so much more difficult. there's so many stats on the pandemic, but one of the ones I think was so meaningful to me was that at the national level, 40% of the people who were earning 40,000 or less working in last February, so now we're a year ago, lost a job in March, and disproportionately those affected people of color. Well, some of those people got their jobs back. Many did not get them back at the same number of hours, or they were part-time. And that impact has lasted throughout this entire year. I know that California unemployment rates have seen increases, and while the state has a combined 9% rate, in many areas that rate is much higher. Nationally, the Low Income Housing Coalition estimates that up to 40 million renters are at risk of eviction. 80% of those risk, other studies show, are people of color. And although we're incredibly excited about, the 25 billion that's out there and potentially more money coming, so many renters, they haven't been able to pay their rent for almost a year now. So that just accumulates and accumulates. And that is something that's really important for us to understand. So Wells Fargo last year responded very quickly to the COVID crisis by providing $225 million across the nation to address food, shelter, housing insecurity, and other critical needs. And nationally, we supported organizations that have kept more than 200,000 people housed. Because again, COVID reinforced to us, literally a home was kind of a matter of life and death for people, and their ability to be safe and healthy. In California, we provided more than $62 million in housing affordability related grants last year, many of them related to COVID. So, and these would include supporting rental relief, legal assistance, housing counseling, and just creating good solutions to help people housed. Also, Wells Fargo, as a home lender and servicer, we are really committed to trying to help homeowners stay in their home. And we did that by waiving fees, forbearance, foreclosure mitigation initiatives, and again, through supporting housing counselors who can be key trusted advisors for that. So going forward, our housing affordability philanthropy strategy is focused on 4 things. 1, increasing the supply. You couldn't have said that better at the start. And I was so excited to hear about some of those initiatives that is addressing upzoning, because at the end of the day, we just literally do not have particularly enough affordable supply. Expanding home ownership, particularly of people of color, really trying to get to that racial wealth gap, increasing housing stability, and then supporting transformation and innovation. And in supporting transformation and innovation, we really work with stakeholders, practitioners, researchers, and innovators across the country, really focused on solving the nation's housing affordability crisis. Because while we're supporting all of those other factors, we know that we have to think about things differently. And that's one of the reasons we're supporting California Forward and efforts like the Region Build Together initiative, because we know that that's a way to influence systemic change. We can't keep doing things the way we've been doing them, right? We're not going to get that out of the crisis in that way. So, California Forward support, bringing together innovators and trailblazers. I know many of you are on the phone today. We want to help support that creative approach, what needs to change across policy and capital and practice, and our assumptions in how we do housing. I just want to say that I really appreciated that California Forward is looking at the complexity of housing issues and not seeing them as kind of, a one-size-fits-all simple solution, and identifying those, because that's what happens too often. And I was like, wow, this is really a big list. But you know what? It was right, because you can't, it's an ecosystem housing, right? You can't just push one lever and hope that it's going to solve. You actually have to be looking at the complexity. And I was very glad to see that you all were doing that, as well as identifying that this is an issue in every region, but the solutions are not necessarily the same. So again, thank you for all that you're doing, for your leadership at California Forward, and for all of you who are on the webinar. And I look forward to listening and learning, and we'll be back at the end for some Q&A. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Eileen. All right. So let's dive into our first region, and that region is the Coachella Valley and the Inland Empire. but I mentioned that the Inland Empire Economic Partnership was an important partner here and put together the regional report that you can check out that talks about Lift to Rise and others. Appreciate the work of Annalisa Worm and Jason Cordova there and all the different folks that they worked with on that report. And to talk about the things that was featured in the report, I want to bring up a couple of folks. Flor Tolley, who's the Associate Vice President of Social Impact and Sustainability for the Inland Empire at Wells Fargo. He's going to tee up and talk a little bit about why they are so excited about the work of Lift to Rise. And with us this morning, we have Heather Vicona, who's the President and CEO of Lift to Rise. But we also wanted to acknowledge the really important work of Araceli Palafox, who's the Deputy Director of Lift to Rise, who is really involved in leading all of this work. So thank you so much, folks, and go ahead and kick it off.
Thank you, Mike. I appreciate that. So we are all too familiar with the housing challenges that our state faces. By recent accounts, our state is experiencing a shortfall of approximately 1.8 million affordable homes. And realizing that no one entity by itself can tackle the housing challenges on its own, corporate philanthropy and foundation is looking for coordinated approaches that enable different stakeholders to work together to achieve greater impact. While Wells Fargo does fund charitable nonprofits that address one or more housing needs, we recognize that it's more impactful to invest in the convening of community and institutional leaders to collectively address complex regional challenges. We also recognize that aligned contribution is more difficult than direct action. So we really elevate visionary partners that have done this effectively. And we're also grateful to California Forward, who with their depth and experience in this space for nearly 10 years, recognized that there was greater collaboration that was needed, and there was additional best practice sharing from regional partners that would be needed in order for our state to be able to solve our housing challenges. A few examples of some regional collaboratives that have really brilliantly coalesced partners in pursuit of economic development include Fresno's Drive, a $4 billion investment plan consisting of 19 initiatives, and then Coachella Valley's Lift to Rise. Lift to Rise is a cross-sector, community-driven initiative focused on improving the lives of the residents in the Coachella Valley. So Coachella Valley extends from the Salton Sea through Riverside County and to the San Torgino Pass. And like so many regions in our state, it's a tale of two cities where we have both beautiful desert resorts, but also significant poverty and infrastructure challenges, particularly in eastern Coachella Valley. So what makes Lift different? What makes it more effective, perhaps in other coalitions? Well, there's a couple of things. First of all, they have developed a very specific laser-focused goal, which includes the production of 10,000 affordable housing units and also reducing the rent burden of families by a third in that region. Their vision is not just housing production alone, but it's housing production paired with bold policy reform and also pipeline development and an investment agenda. At the core of this vision is their soon-to-be launched Coachella Valley Housing Catalyst Fund, which will be a source of flexible, favorably priced capital for community development projects. The fund will finance a current pipeline of $800 million in projects and 2,000 housing units. So it's really a privilege for me to be able to introduce the very dynamic Heather Vicona, who's the president and CEO of Lift to Rise, to really be able to share their collective impact model.
Thank you, Flor. It's wonderful to be here today. And I do just want to acknowledge from the top that my colleague Araceli Palafox was supposed to be with me right now. But one thing that we're also doing at Lift to Rise right now is we are co-leading what is the third largest rental assistance fund per capita nationally. And we began on Monday dispersing our next round of stimulus funding. So we'll begin dispersing an additional $25 million of funding on Monday. And Adeseli is tending to an urgent issue with that. But I'm thrilled. I think that's actually an introduction to, and I'm thrilled to be able to be here today to talk about the Coachella Valley Housing Catalyst Fund. And what we know, which everyone has spoken to in the introduction, pre-COVID and now, is that folks across the state of California are just struggling to stay housed. And so we see every day in the emergency work that we're doing that there's thousands and thousands of folks who just are not able to stay in their homes. And so the Coachella Valley Housing Catalyst Fund is an initiative that we've been working on for 3 years in partnership with Riverside County and dozens of local stakeholders. And our goal really is, this is one prong of, like Flor said, a multi-pronged plan. But our goal really is to radically increase the supply of affordable housing. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start with just a little bit of context setting, both about Lift to Rise and a little bit of what Flora shared about the Coachella Valley. So at Lift to Rise, we hold a North Star, or a vision, that we want all Coachella Valley families to be healthy, stable, and thriving. And we've really identified 2 specific pathways that we're following towards that future. So the first is advancing housing stability, and the second is increasing economic opportunity. We didn't just choose to do these things. We have been an independent organization for almost 3 years now. But before that, we went through a 3-year planning process with dozens of local stakeholders and literally thousands of community residents to identify what are the 1 or 2 root cause drivers that are driving ongoing struggle. And not to a surprise to anyone on the call, but overwhelmingly, residents identified affordability and housing stability as their central root cause driver of struggle. And so the way that we work, and the Catalyst Fund is part of what we call an action plan that was developed with 50 collaborative partners. We've set a 10-year goal. Next slide, please. We've set a 10-year goal of reducing rent burden and radically increasing the supply of affordable housing by 10,000 units. And what we do every 2 years together is we mark out our pathway to get us that much further towards that goal. And so really where we arrived at is a few years ago, we looked at a bunch of data and said, okay, if there's 1 or 2 or 3 things that we could move, what's going to radically shift the condition of well-being of the population? And both data and community residents identified rent burden. So as Eileen and others described earlier on the call, the level of folks who are experiencing rent burden, we're in a policy moment around it now, but a few years ago when we started, it wasn't really at the top of folks' mind. So in the Coachella Valley, we have about 500,000 year-round residents, and folks are probably very familiar with us as a tourism and a recreation economy. In that population of folks that live here year-round, more than half of folks, almost 2/3 of folks, experience rent burden. And what's alarming about our rent burden is folks will know, compared to other places in the state, things are fairly more affordable. We have a supply of land, so we're not facing the same challenge as our metro counterparts. So we set out on a goal to say, what would it be to radically shift the trajectory? And we tried a lot of things to start that were really around how do we increase the stabilization of folks, but fundamentally what we got to is we weren't going to achieve a different future if we could not figure out how to really kickstart and massively produce more units. Next slide, please. And so we've come up with what we think is a bold community investment solution. And I'll start by saying, and if there's anything that anyone takes away from the presentation, the way that we really got to our agenda is by aggregating a regional pipeline. So we've been supported for the last 3 years by the Center for Community Investment and the Lincoln Land Policy Institute and some counterparts across the country to really help build our capacity as an organization together with the County of Riverside to inventory a regional pipeline. So pipelines exist whether we inventory them or not. That's definitely the truth. But our agenda and our partnership has really coalesced around our regional pipeline. So we've coalesced a pipeline of almost 3,000 units. And then what we've done together is we've determined a policy and an investment agenda predicated on that pipeline. And I'll say also at this point that the other thing that inventorying and organizing a regional pipeline allows us to do is, the first is it allows collaboration, and it allows folks to contribute to something that's shared. And it also provides a vehicle for community voice and community power to begin to drive that pipeline. So when we think about the challenge of projects, the challenge of production on a project by project basis, we often get stuck. What happens when we aggregate up to the level of a pipeline is we can start to see patterns in policy and investment, and the Catalyst Fund is really predicated on that pipeline. Next slide, please. So just pausing on this really quickly, a thing to say, our regional production, it was not unlike many other places throughout California, really dropping to really abysmal rates of production annually. And what we're trying to get to is an annual production of at least 1,000 units, which will be a humongous lift, as you can see in the graph, from where we are now. Next slide, please. A thing to say before we go into actually the structure of the fund is that we hold the pipeline based on 3 values. So I'm sure folks are familiar that in the Coachella Valley, we have extreme wealth, and we also have that juxtaposed to extreme poverty. So we have $10 million houses right up the street from where I am, and then we also have folks who are living in inhumane living conditions just right next door. So one of the values that we hold as a region is regional equity, so that our pipeline is prioritized on 3 things. One, it's AMI, so we're making sure that we're advancing and inventorying units that are below 80% of AMI. The second is, so that's really getting at rent burden. The second is readiness. So we know that we can't draw down and attract investment to a pipeline that's not ready because money has to move, otherwise you don't get to have it. And the last is this slide, it's really regional equity. So we really care about the spatial distribution of units across the Coachella Valley and the institutional infrastructure that's combined with those units. And so we're really pushing to make sure that housing is developed in high opportunity areas, and right at the same time, the institutional infrastructure is paired with housing in areas where it's lacking. Next slide, please. So this is just a little bit about our pipeline. The pipeline, I'm sure folks know a pipeline is a real and a live thing. So projects come in and projects fall out. Our current pipeline has about 44 projects in it, getting at 2,800 units, and that's the development cost and the development gap. The product types are on the right-hand side. Those are the product types that have been identified by folks in our collaborative as important product types to support. Next slide, please. So here is, I think, a really important piece. So when we set out to say what would really catalyze and drive this pipeline, a lot of our partners said, well, can we just reinvent RDA? Could we build like just this massive gap fund? And folks will know that's impossible. So what we've done, this slide actually used to be like a 3-legged stool, and the red circle in the middle is the fund. What we've done is we have coordinated together with county housing vouchers and the coordination of city and state funds, a fund structure that will catalyze and unlock those resources. So the housing fund is a catalyst. It is a catalyst to allow resources to be unlocked. It's not filling in and providing all of the gap resources. This is driven by resident leadership and participation. 10 municipalities, so all 9 of our cities in the county are signed on to this, and more than 50 community organizations. Next slide, please. So this is the actual structure of the fund. The fund is it's about $100 to $150 million. The way that we've structured the fund is based on the pipeline itself, so that we're really actually driving what's going to unlock and what's going to make projects moved. So the one thing that I'll say is that the thing that we need in inland California, and not just in the Coachella Valley, but across inland California, is we need long-term patient capital to unlock these other types of product types. And so this fund structure here and the product types that are listed on the left, they're predicated on what this pipeline really actually needs to move. We have, next slide, please. We have engaged, oh, sorry, back to the last slide. I thought we had one more. So we have engaged the Low Income Investment Fund, a leading national CDFI, to be the lead actor that will be hosting our fund. And we're working in partnership also with RCAC and dozens of other actors to contribute to the fund. So the fund will launch likely late next month, early April, and we'll begin moving 5 projects forward. So we expect this year to be able to support at least 500 units moving forward with planning and pre-development capital. I want to pause for a second. Flora, are we good on time? We are? Okay. Sorry, someone just texted and told me I had 90 seconds. So a couple of things that I want to say while we're sitting on the fund structure is that a lot of times housing funds go up, just like a fund structure will go up and people will go to that fund for specific things they need. The Coachella Valley Housing Catalyst Fund is predicated on that pipeline. And so the products that you see on the left, the pipeline has been scrubbed and stress tested. And these are the products that folks in our ecosystem have identified that they need. So a lot of times folks will ask us, like, how did we get to here? What are the steps that we can take? And there's a couple of things that I want to say. First, that I said at the beginning, a pipeline exists whether we organize it or not, whether we inventory it or not, there's a pipeline. But when we approach projects on a project by project basis, what happens is that we use resources suboptimally. And a lot of times everyone on the phone knows in affordable housing development, everyone sort of goes like this and shelters and ducks when projects are being put together. And what we've done by building trust and collaboration is we've been able to put almost everything out there on the table and say, okay, what are the patterns of disinvestment that we see? And also, what are the policy barriers? So then that allows us to work together with our local municipalities to build an agenda to move some of the policy fixes that will also move the units at the same time. I think that the key is regions can do this across the state of California. In fact, lots of folks are. But the key to being able to determine our own destiny is to coalesce a pipeline and to scrub that pipeline and then to drive an agenda based on that pipeline. So there's tons and tons of programs available at the state. We're working with lots of folks at HCD and other places. And the number one thing that people come back and say to us is, like, are you familiar with this funding source? Or are you familiar with that funding source? Yes. Like, folks know and are coordinated on all sorts of funding sources. But for us as a region in inland California, we very often can't get in the game of even unlocking resources that are, say, available at the state, because it often costs like $1 million just to get there. So the number one thing that we've heard from folks in the ecosystem is folks need really patient pre-development capital. So by aligning our pipeline and pulling it together, by building an agenda and having shared trust, we've been able to come up with a solution. We often say we've MacGyvered our way to here, and that this is definitely a DIY fund. And this is how we're going to be able to move forward and rapidly increase our supply. So I just want to pause there and ask Flora if you had anything you wanted to add before our time is up.
No, thank you, Heather. As always, we could see your passion, your leadership, and your dedication to really moving the challenges in the region. So I think with this, we'll go ahead and continue on with our agenda, and we're going to take questions at the end, Heather.
Thank you, Flora.
Thank you.
Moving north, I'd like to bring up a couple of folks. They're going to be talking about some fantastic stuff that's going on in the Sacramento region. And the work of the regional analyses for the Northern California was done by the Bay Area Council Economic Institute. I want to call out in particular Isabel Monteleone, who is the lead researcher there. And I want to introduce Karin Wood, who's really been the lead for this entire project for us. She's Vice President of Social Impact and Sustainability for Northern California at Wells Fargo. And she's going to be presenting with Casey Lizon, who's the Deputy Executive Director of Planning and Programs at the Sacramento Council of Governments. So Karin, take it away.
Thank you, Micah. Good morning, everybody. Wells Fargo believes in climate change, and it continues to be one of the most critical environmental and social issues of our time. And we're working across our value chain to advance the transition of a low carbon economy and to reduce the impacts of climate change on our business, our customers, our communities, and our employees. And as California and the Biden administration are making significant environmental commitments, the necessity for all of us to come together becomes more urgent. So how can Wells Fargo help achieve these complex commitments, specifically as it relates to housing? Well, one approach is to deploy capital. Wells Fargo announced in 2018 our commitment to lend or invest $200 billion in the environmentally sustainable businesses and projects by 2030, with 50% focused on transactions that directly support the transition to a lower carbon economy, including renewables, energy efficient technologies, green buildings, green bonds, some of which are directly support housing affordability related development and projects. Another way is to use our philanthropic resources to strategically invest in critical sustainability initiatives along the housing spectrum, from land use, transportation, energy infrastructure, to new and innovative construction and retrofitting existing architecture. All include cost and energy saving approaches to ensure structures are as efficient and affordable as possible. And we couple those investments with eco-friendly practices, such as building new construction near public transportation, underwriting green bonds and revolving credit facilities to sustainably linked pricing, as well as seeking alternative green financing to support housing affordability projects and technology for increasing that inventory and access. And additionally, Wells Fargo drives innovative solutions to scale by underwriting these multi-stakeholder collaborations and investing in clean tech incubators. We've already referenced a few examples on the call today, demonstrated through our partnership with California Forward, as well as Lift to Rise and Fresno Drive. All of these initiatives have an environmental consideration as part of their overall plan. But other examples include utilizing a place-based strategy supporting cities, mayors, and tribes, like the LA Clean Tech Incubator Project, working with the LA Mayor's Office to deploy pilot programs in housing or related clean tech with the goal of finding solutions to meet their city's carbon neutral goals. Additionally, Wells Fargo supported the Tribal Solar Accelerator Fund, catalyzing growth of solar energy and expanding solar job opportunities in tribal communities. We all have a certain role to play, and we all need to play that together as we address climate change. However, as we promote climate friendliness and a low carbon lifestyle becomes much more increasingly desirable, housing justice and gentrification also must be considered in the planning and investment strategies. Wells Fargo will continue to broadly invest in green options and to increase access to a cleaner, safer, more equitable and efficient housing for our neighbors. And here to speak about their commitment to advance the quality of life in Sacramento region is again, Casey Lazan. Casey, take it away.
Thank you, Karin. I am very pleased to be here. To give us some context, the Sacramento region that I'll be talking about is home to 2.5 million people in 22 cities and 6 counties. And in addition to being home to the state capital, we are suburban, rural, and urban communities. We are flatland, foothill, and mountain communities. We are racially, ethnically, politically, income diverse places. And as the front yard of the state capitol, we want to be a laboratory to innovate on policy. And I'm also excited to be here to say we want to share and exchange learnings with the rest of the state. SACOG, as you heard, is an association of cities and counties in the region. And it's the place where the region's cities and counties come together to plan for their future and to tackle challenges that are bigger than any one community can solve on its own. As an association, we work in partnership with our regional, private, and nonprofit sector partners because we know that challenges are solved and opportunities are found by the collaborations of public, private, and nonprofit actors, as we are hearing about today, to work towards a common goal. Next slide, please. And so on this screen, you will see some of our many partners who are supporters of our Green Means Go initiative. And that is the particular collaboration that I am very excited to be able to talk to you about today. Next slide, please. Green Means Go is a place-based investment strategy that emerged out of the planning work that Sacramento area local governments and their private and nonprofit civic partners has conducted over the last several years. In short, Green Means Go is a multi-year pilot program that's proposed to lower greenhouse gas emissions in the 6 counties of the Sacramento region by accelerating infill development through infrastructure investments and local policy changes, and reducing and electrifying vehicle trips. Why are we doing this? It's an answer to ambitious and necessary state, regional, and local goals. SACOG, like other regional agencies around the state, is charged under state law with developing a 20+ year plan. It's also known as a sustainable community strategy. And this plan has to show how the region will achieve greenhouse gas emissions reductions from transportation by more efficient development patterns. It also has to show how we will house the expected future population of our region. And it has to meet a host of transportation goals, including managing congestion, improving and maintaining the physical conditions of transportation, supporting goods movement, increasing options for people to travel, improving the safety of travel, and reducing other tailpipe pollutants to clean the air and improve public health. Suffice to say, this sustainable community strategy has to achieve a lot of goals, and it can't sacrifice one goal for the other. It has to demonstrate a path to a sustainable future. It's your classic triple bottom line. It's a path that is environmentally sustainable, economically sustainable, and gives people an equitable opportunity to thrive. So, Green Means is to the global challenges of housing, climate, and transportation. Next slide, please. So here's how we got to Green Means Go as a bottom-up solution. Our region needs to build nearly 11,000 new homes a year over the next 20 years to accommodate the housing needs of our growing population. For that housing to also help us meet our climate and transportation and equity mobility goals, 2/3 of that housing per year, or about 7,000 homes a year, needs to be built in infill areas. And a lot of that needs to be in attached homes. So this slide is showing you what we are currently doing. The green line is showing what our actual population growth has been over the last 20-ish years. The dotted orange line shows you what housing we should be producing, and then the orange solid line shows you what our actual housing growth has been, and it is not dissimilar from the rest of the state. In our region, that translates into, well, we've only been building about half of the housing that we need to be building. So given this situation, given what we know we're trying to achieve, we asked and answered the question among local government officials, market rate and affordable housing developers and builders, policymakers and advocates, what needs to change in order to get more infill development, and especially infill housing development. Next slide, please. The answer boiled down to, we need to reduce cost and risk. So some of that is in the control of local agencies and some is not. For the local agency part, they said, we can work on local policy change and planning. But they said, well, we need help with this funding for the infrastructure, and specifically for infrastructure that supports a density of infill development. It's very often cost prohibitive to bring infill housing to market, especially in this inland California market, because of a variety of costs, because of the wages that we earn, and therefore the rents and the prices that you can command for that product. But the biggest cost among these that they've been identifying in these infill areas is the need for infrastructure, water, sewer, drainage, and other utility upgrades, in addition to transportation. So we worked together, local and regional stakeholders, to organize those changes into the initiative that is Green Means Go. Next slide, please. And so what Green Means Go will be is a pilot of a regional approach to allocate a proportional share of existing state grant funding to public works infrastructure investments, such as the examples that you see here. And when adequately supported, those investments will create more infill housing opportunities and greater mobility, while also achieving greenhouse gas emissions reductions and stimulating the economy to recover from the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. So pictures tell a lot. And so I want to give you some examples of infill opportunities around the region and tell you what local actions Green Means Go could do to support infill housing. Next slide, please. So this is a former motel block on Stockton Boulevard in the city of Sacramento. It's a future bus rapid transit corridor. The city has already reduced local fees. They've provided a density bonus. They've adopted a transit-oriented development zoning ordinance. And you've also heard about some things they've done citywide earlier at the beginning of this webinar, including removing single-family zoning as a restriction. But this particular location needs drainage and water upgrades in order to unlock over 1,000 new homes and 5,000 new jobs. Next slide, please. To the east in Rancho Cordova, this is a former suburban strip center that's located across from a light rail station. The area is identified for housing and commercial transit-oriented development in the Folsom Boulevard specific plan, but they need to pay for drainage upgrades to enable development on that 20 acres. Next slide, please. To the west, West Main Street in the city of Woodland, in fact, the city has reduced impact fees and done a comprehensive zoning update. What this Main Street needs is sewer, water, and street upgrades to unlock nearly 300 new homes. Next slide, please. And then finally, up the hill in North Auburn, this is a former Army hospital site. It's identified in the Placer County Government Center Master Plan for over 2,000 new homes, but it needs sewer upgrades in order to catalyze that development. Next slide, please. So those were really just a few examples illustrating potential sustainable housing opportunities from proactive state funding for infrastructure. Many of these locations are on 20th century older commercial corridors where infrastructure was built for low intensity, car-oriented, low density suburban strip malls and commercial uses. Just like the one that you're seeing here in this visual simulation. So to solve our climate and housing crises, we need to transform these commercial strips into walkable, accessible, equitable neighborhoods and places. Next slide, please. At a much faster pace, the visual sim of an after. And this is an actual place in Sacramento where they have been working on this vision for 20 years. And we are starting to see some of it, but knowing the housing crisis that we have and the climate crisis and the equity crisis we face, we need to see that happening much faster. Next slide, please. So in my examples, I mentioned the policy changes of a few jurisdictions. In fact, 28 of our 28 jurisdictions support Green Means Go, and 23 have already adopted green zones, which are showing on this map. Green zones are key areas for which the jurisdiction is saying that that green zone has space for infill capacity, is in an area identified in their local plans for infill development, and is in a center, a corridor, or an established community as identified in SACOG's Sustainable Communities Strategy. So these are places, by the way, that are all over our diverse region of flatland to mountain, rural to urban. Next slide, please. So in this sense, I hope what I'm illustrating for you is that Green Means Go truly is a regional partnership. The actions listed on this slide show a bottoms-up solution of local, regional, and state actions that together can achieve our shared housing, transportation, and climate goals. For the local part, all of the nominated green zones are supported by local actions, such as the ones that are listed here, to promote infill transportation options. For the regional part, SACOG has developed toolkits of policy best practices for readying places for infill development. We are also, with great help from the state's regional early action plan funds, using that for housing planning. We're providing housing funding for local policy changes, studies, and planning in green zones. And then for the state's part, what we are seeking is a proportional share of regional funds for existing state grant funds to support the public works infrastructure investments that we are identifying in earlier slides. Next, please. The infill focused housing that Green Means Go would provide would, just to summarize, ease development pressure on our precious agricultural resources, ease the pressure on high-risk fire areas, provide needed housing with a low carbon footprint, and provide access to opportunity because they are happening in those infill locations that are closer to existing needs and amenities. And it would reinvest in the public, civic, and private infrastructure that is already in place in our communities, but where we have a significant amount of aging infrastructure and a need for some reinvestment there. So as I said up front, we hope to be a pilot for this program. We hope to be able to learn a lot from that and share that across the state. And I thank you for your attention and look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Karin and Casey. And now we're going to move to our last region and our last set of community-focused innovations. And for that, I'm going to turn it over to Martin Sanchez, who's the Vice President for Engagement Initiatives and Mortgage Outreach for Wells Fargo, as well as Tom DeSimone, who's the President and CEO of Genesis LA. Martin, take it away.
Thank you, Micah, and good afternoon, everyone. At Wells Fargo, we believe innovative housing solutions are crucial tools in reducing housing poverty and homelessness, improving health outcomes, boosting economic mobility, supporting job creation and retention, and strengthening the California economy. Wells Fargo is committed to being a creative and innovative partner and collaborator in all areas of the housing affordability spectrum. For example, Wells Fargo and Enterprise Community Partners launched the Housing Affordability Breakthrough Challenge, a nationwide search for the most innovative, scalable, sustainable, and viable ideas to increase housing affordability solutions. 6 winning organizations, including California-based Impact Justice, were selected to receive $2 million in grants and 2 years of technical assistance to bring innovative concepts to market, such as building more equitable, healthier, and resilient homes that radically reduce carbon emissions, to re-engineering the affordable housing delivery system, and rethinking community reentry by building dignity through a home. Another great example of a public-private partnership to advance sustainable solutions to the housing crisis is the Wells Fargo Innovation Incubator, a technology incubator and platform funded by the Wells Fargo Foundation and co-administered by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, NREL. Through this innovation incubator, 3 California organizations are harnessing the world-class expertise and facilities at NREL. Cypress Materials in Berkeley creates paintable, heat-reflective coatings as a roofing retrofit for both residential and commercial buildings to reduce cooling loads. Pre-Framing Corp, also in Berkeley, offers faster wall framing installation at lower costs. And SPAN in San Francisco develops products to reduce the cost and complexity of adopting distributed energy systems. Throughout the Central Valley region, housing authorities and community foundations are providing much needed backbone support to emerging neighborhood CDCs that are critical in addressing housing affordability. Wells Fargo partnered with the Fresno Housing Authority to support the capacity building of 5 CDCs in the Fresno region. This initial investment was then leveraged for additional investments by the other funders to formalize the Fresno Community and Economic Development Partnership, a partnership of 14 neighborhood CDCs. In the Los Angeles area, Wells Fargo is proud to support organizations such as Genesis LA, which is part of the solution to innovate housing. Next, you'll hear from President and CEO of Genesis LA, Tom DeSimone, who has been helping to lead efforts through an ADU working group with LA Moss and Rebuilding Neighborhoods Los Angeles to study ADU policy, permitting, financing, design, and construction. In addition to Genesis LA's work with ADUs, Tom will highlight other small housing models and land use incentives they have employed to lower costs, expedite development, and support missing middle infill housing types. Welcome, Tom. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Martin. So Genesis LA is a nonprofit CDFI community loan fund, and we serve the Los Angeles County region with particular focus on the South LA, East LA, and parts of the San Fernando Valley regions within the county. We make affordable and flexible loans to both affordable housing and nonprofit facilities and economic development projects. In the housing space, we've been particularly interested and focused on investments that advance various forms of innovation and include flexible financing products, the use of new land use incentives and targeting missing middle housing types that have often been key to solving the affordability crisis, but have been difficult to build. In the ADU realm, our work actually started with partnering with Mayor Garcetti's office before the state laws changed, which many of you probably know radically changed the environment and potential for building ADUs in the state. Before the state law changed, there were only about 30 ADUs completed in the city of Los Angeles in any given year, and that was an average for about the decade before the state law changed. So our team was looking at three things: the regulatory environment, which ultimately changed quite a bit with the state, the design of ADUs, and how to get them financed. What you see on the screen here is the pilot project that the team worked on in Highland Park. This was a 2-bedroom ADU with a living room and a replacement garage that was needed at the time when it was first permitted. Of course, parking has been made much more lenient under the state laws. Our focus at Genesis was on how to get these types of ADUs financed. What some research had done through some focus groups with the mayor's office was discovered that most ADUs that were getting built, again, a much lower volume at the time, were being built with folks who had access to liquidity. So they were able to get a home equity line of credit on their home, or they had enough equity in their home to obtain a cash out refinance loan. And we realized that if these ADUs are costing about $100,000 to $200,000, the value that an ADU would add to the property would be much more, would add much more than the cost to build it. So your collateral would be increasing. And once you rent this out, the homeowner is able to bring in rental income that would supplement their income and be able to really qualify for traditional financing once the ADU is built. But there was this gap period that lenders could not lend now because there wasn't enough equity in the home yet, and they couldn't underwrite to prospective rental income. So we put a team together called Backyards Homes, and it consisted of LA Moss, a well-known nonprofit design firm in LA that did all of the design work, including this beautiful ADU you see on the screen. Restore Neighborhoods LA, which is a experienced small-scale affordable housing developer that executed the city of LA's NSP program during the last foreclosure crisis. We also brought in Self-Help Federal Credit Union because they were set up to already do mortgage lending and consumer lending. They had all of the regulatory requirements to do that. And we worked with them to actually underwrite financing to bridge that exact gap that I described. So they would refinance the homeowner's existing first mortgage and provide an extra tranche of financing to build an ADU. And they would underwrite to the future value of the home once the ADU is completed, so they could have more collateral value to underwrite the loan. And they would account 75% of the market rent that could come in from that unit, so that they could factor in income to help the homeowner qualify. And in order to help Self-Help do this, to induce them to offer this product, Genesis LA offered to guarantee the ADU tranche of financing that Self-Help was extending beyond their normal credit policies. So we launched a pilot program called Backyard Homes. Interestingly, the Turner Center at Berkeley put out a report, I think late last year, that identified this very gap as a persistent issue in the market, and some of the banking regulations that still need to be overcome to make mainstream financial institutions offer this more frequently. Next slide, please. In here you can see the team designed some prototypes to help homeowners be able to visualize what some of the potential was with their home, and to have some base plans to really work off of to make these units even more affordable and to be able to be built faster. We have a few projects underway now with the pilot program. And one of the things we did discover was that many people were interested in this, including making these units affordable, and were able to access more traditional financing than they were just a few years back when we started this work. And we believe that there's two factors in that. One, of course, living in California, you all know the home price of real estate just continues to go up. And so it doesn't take much time in this environment for homeowners to build that equity in their home and be able to leverage that quicker through a home equity line or a refi. A second piece is that with rates going down, you can borrow more money even if you don't have to factor in the prospective rental income. And the market has actually addressed some of the financing gap here, but we think that the product we help to design really has a strong future because one, the economic climate will not be like this forever, and those underwriting considerations, will need to adapt to something more akin to what we've designed. But the second piece is that I think philanthropy and government also often wonder how can we help to bridge that financing, and we specifically designed this product so that philanthropy, government, CDFIs like us could provide that guarantee support that could leverage traditional financing sources. So rather than creating new programs all the time, how can you de-risk fairly conventional products and really meet the broadest scale market of finance? The second area I wanted to touch on real briefly, and you can move to the next slide, is innovations that we've been trying to support through zoning reforms. Always a hot topic at the state level with upzoning and changing a lot of the zoning. And in Los Angeles, we have not only the state density laws that have come down, but the transit-oriented communities policy that was adopted by the voters and implemented by the planning department a few years ago. And this transit-oriented communities, or TOC, is basically a voluntary inclusionary program. You get a density bonus in exchange for setting aside affordable units. And between the TOC ordinance and the density bonus, these two incentive programs account for over half of housing units permitted in the city of Los Angeles now. About 54% utilize one of these two tools. So it really shows the pathways that are being opened through the use of these incentives. I think one of the things we've learned a lot working in this space is that we used to build a lot of naturally affordable housing. We used to do this very well and before World War II. And then a lot of, frankly, bad zoning and parking rules came in and technically made it illegal to build low-cost, smaller-scale housing. And these are some of the most beloved types of architecture really across the state. If you think of bungalow court buildings like the one you see here that we help to finance, or garden-style apartments. These are sort of the architectural gems in many older neighborhoods, and you cannot build them under many zoning laws today. And so what we've been really focused on is utilizing the incentives that are embedded in these density bonus and land use reforms, both locally and statewide, to peel back and relearn some of those lessons from 80 years ago that helped us get this type of housing built more quickly and more cost effectively. So this is a bungalow gardens project. It's 8 units where a single family home had previously sat. It received a small grant from the County of Los Angeles for an innovation design award. And effectively, if you know bungalow courts, they're basically tiny homes, which we hear a lot about. Tiny homes as a possible innovation today. What bungalow courts were a century ago was taking a single family home and putting 8 or 10 little cottages on it where a house might have been, and getting more density out of that site. And that's exactly what we did here with our partner, also Restore Neighborhoods Los Angeles. And just to give you a sense, you hear $500,000–600,000 for an affordable 1-bedroom or studio apartment in California. This particular project is being built for $200,000 per unit, which includes the land cost. And this will be used as housing, permanent supportive housing for the homeless. Next slide, please. This next project is another similar project. This is in the Willowbrook neighborhood of South Los Angeles, unincorporated LA County area. This is more of your garden style apartment. This will have 7 units and a community room that will be used also by a neighboring church, community partner that's with us in this project. And this will also serve a formerly homeless residents. Next slide, please. This next rendering is another project that is underway, about to be permit ready. This shows more density, which is possible because we were able to eliminate all parking through the City of LA density bonus policies. This will also be permanent supportive housing, and this is being funded with government funds as well through the city's HHH program for homeless housing. And again, as a sort of to compare what we're typically seeing affordable housing built for, this this project is coming in under $300,000 per unit now, and it has all of the government requirements of prevailing wages and things like that on it. So, you know, land use incentives and density bonuses and parking reductions or eliminations have really been able to show they can yield significant cost savings when executed. And I think the work that our partners have been doing, they're starting to show that. Just real quick in closing, you know, I think a couple takeaways of where I think this effort for land use reform needs to go is to continue to try to peel back those discretionary approvals. You know, to be blunt about it, there's been some bad press lately locally with corruption at the government level for how projects are permitted. And part of that is because we don't just set rules and let the rules apply. We have way too much discretion in how we build and permit throughout this state, and we need to continue to whittle away that, set the rules and let the rules play themselves out and set good rules. A second piece is, you know, we've talked a lot about entitlements and land use, but there's a whole load of reform that has to happen down at the permitting level. It is still an excruciatingly slow process to get permitted. So you can have the legal right to build something, but you still have to go through dozens of clearances from various different local government agencies to build pull your building permit. And that is now, after these land use reforms have been adopted, the building permitting process is now the next major bottleneck. And I really hope that legislators who are thinking more about policy can start to adopt some rules or mandates at the local level that can force local governments to start to think about how permitting can also be much more efficient and time responsive. So some next steps I hope we can all work on together. That's all. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you, Tom. Hang tight. We'll come back to you for a Q&A portion at the end. So back to you, Micah.
Great.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Martin. Thank you, Tom. And we have tons of questions, so I'm going to just try to wrap it up here real quick. In order to do so, I am going to turn it over to Molly Porter, the Senior Vice President and Philanthropy Leader for Wells Fargo, with a call to action to corporate philanthropy and others who can really lean in this area. Molly.
Yeah, thanks, Micah. And again, I'm just so proud that Wells Fargo was able to play a part in bringing this critical housing report to life. I will say I know we're running a bit behind on time and we want to get to all these great questions that I see coming through in the chat, so I will try to be very brief. We've heard a lot today about the challenges that California faces in creating affordable homes for people at all income levels. And we know that no one entity can solve all of these challenges or any of the other social, economic, or environmental problems that we all face alone. Government entities, community-led NGOs, think tanks, and others all have a stake in these issues. But it's also true that corporate philanthropy can play a role in building a more inclusive and sustainable future, particularly as our economy and our communities continue to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. So what can corporate philanthropy do to help? Well, we can start by shifting from a charity-based mindset to a strategy that focuses on driving catalytic change. And in 2019, Wells Fargo did just that. We've begun an ongoing journey to help solve pressing societal issues right here in California and in cities all across the US. We've done that by narrowing our philanthropic investment strategy, as Eileen said earlier, to focus on 4 issues that we think are critical to economic advancement. One is championing safe and affordable housing, what we're talking about here today. Second is opening pathways to financial success. Third is helping small businesses to thrive. And finally, we're working on accelerating a just transition to a low carbon economy. And underlying each of these areas of focus is a deep commitment to championing issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and to doing our part to help narrow the racial wealth gap. And we're combining our business scale and expertise with this philanthropic strategy to uncover innovation, to address local issues, and to catalyze greater housing affordability for all. With this Regions Build Together report being just one of the many great examples of putting that strategy into action. Through 2025, Wells Fargo will donate $1 billion in philanthropy alone to address challenges posed by the housing affordability crisis. This includes efforts focused on housing stability, expanding pathways for homeownership, creating housing supply, and supporting innovation and transformation in local communities. And we encourage other organizations to utilize their own business, human, and philanthropic resources to do the same, so that together we could enhance our collective impact. We know that all impact is local, and Wells Fargo has a deep and long-standing commitment to supporting innovative groups like California Forward, who are working at the ground level to enact change in the communities where we live and work. And before I wrap up, I just want to acknowledge that we as a society right now are facing significant headwinds in our collective community impact work. The ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, political division like we've never seen before, and increasing economic disparities that are leading to a widening of the racial wealth gap. But despite all of this, we have a tremendous opportunity to demonstrate bold leadership, to come together and drive meaningful change to ensure that all Californians have a safe and affordable place to call home. So on behalf of Wells Fargo, I want to thank each of you for your contributions today. I want to say a special thank you to Micah and all of the California Forward staff and partners for all of the great work that you've done on this report. So with that, Micah, I'll turn it back to you, and hopefully we can get into some of these questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Molly, and thanks to the Wells Fargo team for your partnership here. Okay, so I actually want to kind of make this call to action within the context of a question that we got from Ron Millam, which is, how does this all fit together, right? So you have this Regions Rise Together report. You have the, the actions of the California Stewardship Network. You have the actions that are outlined in the Roadmap to Shared Prosperity coming out of the California Economic Summit. I and others have been participating in the production of a document called Roadmap Home. And basically, this report really is kind of a comprehensive, regionally anchored set of plans that is really very inclusive of all the different sort of more specific advocacy actions out there. So in our Roadmap to Shared Prosperity, we're carrying forward a couple of those actions, especially around the reuse of commercial lands and making sure that we have the infrastructure to support housing. So that's sort of our California Forward Action Fund piece of this. And the Roadmap Home, run by folks at Housing California and others, is really focusing in particular on below market rate. So that's a really important plan. And then the groups that you've heard about today, our research partners and others in the California Stewardship Network, are really leaning in on implementing these plans in the regional level in partnership with the private sector, in partnership with others. Please go to the website on your screen to download the report. Get involved in the California Economic Summit, where we move a lot of this together. And to be involved more in our statewide work or in the regional work, the best place to do that is our newsletter through californiaforward.org. So let's jump into some of the questions here. And in order to do that, I'm going to do a little bit of a lightning round with a couple of questions I can answer quickly, and then I'm going to pose questions to some of the different presenters. So Kathy Cresswell, who's actually been, was for a number of years a leader of our California Economic Summit Housing Action Team, really called our attention in her question to the rental burden for people at low and extremely low incomes. And in this specific presentation in the report, we focused on regional differentiation. But if you check out our California Dream Index at cadreamindex.org, you can actually look at everything from rental burden to access to clean drinking water by income as well as by geography, and see how people with $25,000 or less in income are faring. And as Kathy points out, you're going to see that rates of housing cost burden are the highest for people that have the least. So thank you so much for that, Kathy. And also want to quickly say to Jason Wright that we'd like to do a better job of connecting with these issues as it relates to the overlap with our state's indigenous communities. So we'll be reaching out to you right away after this webinar to make sure that we're presenting a plan that is going to work for all the people in our state. And then before I jump into a couple of questions, just a quick acknowledgements. Want to acknowledge Shannon Sedgwick and her team at the Los Angeles Economic Development Corporation, who I didn't flag yet, for the regional analyses for Los Angeles and that part of the state. And then I want to thank in particular our Associate Director of Public Policy, who's been behind the scenes here, moving the slides, curating the questions, who is the primary author of the report, and really who's been powering this whole project. That's Jennifer Lovett, who's absolutely amazing. So thank you so much, Jennifer, for all your work on this report, and also our senior editor, Pam Winters, who really helped get this together. Okay, so first question to Heather Vicona. So Heather, if you're still with us, I wanted to ask you a question from Matt Schwartz, who talked about the affirmatively furthering fair housing goals. But I think the meat of the question is that HCD and a lot of bond programs and tax credit programs focus on trying to get affordable housing into areas with quote unquote good schools and high resources, right? So how do you think about the, where, because I'm just talk a little bit more about when you think about where we really need to make sure to have these units, how do you balance that across the different geographies of your region?
Sure, that's a good question. I think for us, it starts, it all starts and ends with the pipeline. To be able to look at it regionally and say, it's really for, I think, the community to identify where do we need units. And so, for instance, in the Coachella Valley, we have a product type, Polanco's. It's a specific type of farm worker housing. It's a specific type of modular or mobile type. And a lot of times folks will say like, well, maybe we shouldn't invest in that because it's not necessarily the best tool for wealth building, but it's what the community identifies that they want. So I think when we look at the pipeline and listen to community residents and partners, it's really looking at it and being able to say, okay, how do we advance plan for what the question asks about? So how do we advance plan for institutional infrastructure and other things? But I think it's really community knowledge that should drive where development should occur, because the programs are not often tailored with community knowledge and community history in mind.
Yeah, I think that's just that's why I wanted to answer that question, right? We have these very like social engineering views of where we should or shouldn't have below market rate housing, but if ultimately we're trying to help folks, listening to them about where they would like affordable housing is a critical piece of it as well. So thank you so much for that work. I want to turn to Casey from Sacramento. We had a question from Ray Grimes. So and this is around, we often hear about, wanting to increase density for housing in sort of infill urban areas. And how do we think about increasing density in high income areas, right? In high income, fairly, less dense areas. How have you folks been thinking about that in Green Means Go and increasing density throughout all of the urbanized footprint in the region?
Yeah, it's a really great question, and I think it may tie a bit into the long range planning that we do, the cities and counties in the region, as well as housing elements. The question of really furthering housing come up. Have to bring that into their housing elements now. And the step before that is in the regional housing needs planning. And so we have been working with our cities and counties to bring that into our regional housing need. So that those high opportunity communities, those high income areas that you're describing, are places where there is need. And so we are those communities are being asked to zone for to accommodate more housing types than they've traditionally had. Second thing is, even further back from that, our region has been working a very long time on trying to do sustainable land use planning for many decades into the future. And so across those different cities and counties, the the higher income and higher opportunity communities, they all have areas within their current cities where they can and have identified places for more intense housing to occur there. And so what we're trying to do with Green Means Go is to actually bring the resources, put all our resources together to try to make that start to actually happen, because like the policy has been on the books for a long time. So what's stopping it? Let's pull those barriers down. Let's bring the partners together to make it happen. I hope
Awesome.
that answers that question.
Yeah, cool. Thank you so much, Casey. All right, Tom, if I could turn to you. We're talking about housing, and someone was worried that this was maybe a third rail question, but any question in housing I sort of feel like is a third rail question. I was extraordinarily impressed with the price points that you've been able to bring these developments in at. And you talked a little bit about, streamlining and so on. How about building codes, right? To what extent have you run into, building codes as being obviously something that we need on some level, right? But also an area where, it's increasing costs and, can have an impact on total cost.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, part of what we've been able to do with some of those prototypes you saw that were on the more affordable end, building one story, for example, you're eliminating stairwells and all these different code related egress issues. And this is another thing, when we talk about affordable housing, it's almost big A affordable housing, almost always has government funding in it. And government funding brings a lot of extra requirements that go above and beyond the building code. And I think that's another thing that we should be looking at. I think it's a big reason why our tax credit projects start to go up. Those budget numbers start to go up through the roof. For example, any building you build that has public money in it needs an elevator if you go above the first floor, but the building code doesn't require it unless you go up to 4 floors. So is there a middle ground we can do? Can we still make sure that the ground floor has plenty of accessible units for people with mobility restrictions or limitations, but still be able to pull some of those cost drivers like elevators and multiple stairwells and stuff out? I think there's a lot of need to look at that stuff. But going back to these simple construction, people think the only way to get efficiency is to build 100 units in one project. In some ways and in some locations that makes sense, but in a more kind of middle density suburban type of environment, what I think we've been showing is you can actually add reasonable density to these things. It can still fit into the context of those neighborhoods, and building 1 or 2 story buildings actually has some inherent cost efficiencies in it, which is why we were doing this so much better 80 years ago before the World War II.
Cool. Well, thanks, Tom. Yeah, we've got a report coming out specifically drilling into racial equity and home ownership, and creating units that are affordable by design is just as important as creating units that are technically below market rate deed restricted. So it's an all of the above strategy. So thank you so much for your work in LA.
Thank you.
I want to close with one statement. This is addressed to Molly, but if Molly or Eileen from the Wells Fargo team wants to respond to it, I wanted to bring in a question from Shelby Stamps, who says, on behalf of the Central Valley Urban Institute, I want to thank California Forward for creating the space to listen and learn. My question is for Molly from Wells Fargo. How do you plan to center your investment strategy to move the needle on economic inclusion, specifically for the African American community?
Yeah, this is a great question. So thank you for asking that. We have, as we mentioned before, our 4 key areas of focus. But as I said, underlying each one of those is a really deep commitment to looking at equity, particularly racial equity, as it plays into these 4 areas that are critical to economic advancement. And as we think about really what our theme needs to be in 2021, thinking about where we are at right now as a society, we've talked a lot about this concept of an inclusive and sustainable recovery. We know that we're dealing right now with sort of dual pandemics, right? The pandemic of systemic injustice and racism, and that's really only been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic that we're dealing with. Some of the statistics that Eileen shared earlier around the impact of BIPOC-owned small businesses and the way that the employment rate has hurt communities, it hasn't been equal. We know that communities of color have been disproportionately impacted. So what are we going to do? one of the things that we're looking at is really seeing how can we be investing in nonprofit organizations that are led by people of color, not just ones that are serving people of color. And how can we look at capacity building too, so that we are able to actually put the power in the hands of people who have lived experience in this area, as opposed to trying to solve all of these problems by ourselves, which we talked about earlier is not really the right solution here. So we continue to think a lot about this. As I said, we're really moved away from that concept of charity, and we're into deep systems thinking. So that is top of mind for us in 2021. Great question. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Molly. Thanks, Eileen. Thanks, Karin and Martin and Floor. Thank you so much, Heather and Tom and Casey. Thank you so much to the Inland Empire Economic Partnership, the LAEDC, the Bay Area Council Economic Institute, all the members of the California Stewardship Network. This is a team sport, folks, and we're all on the same team. So thank you so much for spending time with us today and for all the work that we've been doing in partnership across the state. And next up in our equitable economies, we're really going to be digging in on forest resiliency. Obviously, this is a huge issue for the people and the economy of the state. So how can we live better with our natural environment? So join us next Thursday at 11 a.m. to hear about some really great innovative projects in that area. All right, folks, have a wonderful day, and we'll talk to you really soon.